Moldova, it sounds like a made-up country, kind of like Junovia. But in truth, it's real, and it's got a pretty interesting story. Actually, I'll even go as far as to say that it's got one of the most interesting stories in European history, precisely because it's not really Moldova's story. It's everyone else's. And Moldova just happened to be standing on the land they all wanted. Okay, so before it was Moldova, this territory was just incredibly good soil that the Cucu-Tănitri-Pilia civilization discovered around 5500 BC. So they built settlements, made sophisticated pottery, farmed land. You know, typical things old civilizations did to survive. It was peaceful, agricultural, and organised. Then the Dacians came through. You probably know them from our Romania story, which if you haven't watched yet, is in the description below. But going back, after the Dacians arrived, the Romans conquered the region in 106 AD. This is actually important, because that's the reason why the Latin language stuck. So even though the Romans pulled out by 271, the language they brought stayed. That's why Moldovans today speak something that's essentially Romanian. Now after Rome left, the region practically became a revolving door for Goths, Huns, Avars, and Slavs. Wave after wave, each one making the ethnic picture messier and more complicated. Then, in the 14th century, a principality emerged named after the Moldova River. Technically, local Vlachs started organising it around 1359, but it was officially consolidated as an independent state by a ruler named Bogdan the Founder, or Bogdan the First. So that was Moldavia in a nutshell. It was a real state, it had its own prince, its own army, and was firmly rooted in Eastern Orthodoxy. It stretched all the way from the Carpathian Mountains to the Dniester River, covering most of modern Moldova, plus a couple of big chunks of what is now Romania and Ukraine. And for a moment, no matter how brief, it was powerful. Stephen the Great ruled from 1457 to 1504, and he was, by any measure, extraordinary. He beat the Hungarians and the Poles. He fought the Ottomans repeatedly, and won more than he lost, which almost nobody in southeastern Europe could really say at the time. And if those accolades weren't enough, he also built fortresses and monasteries that still stand today. And remember their religion I mentioned a while back? Well, the Orthodox Church eventually made him a saint, and to this day, he's literally the face on every single paper banknote of the Moldovan currency. Talk about a legacy. Though his impact lives on, Moldavia's golden era pretty much ended there. Because the rulers that followed, well, let's just say they were nothing like him. And by 1538, after Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent marched in, Moldavia officially became an Ottoman vassal state. Here's the thing though, the Ottomans weren't interested in governing it directly. They wanted tribute, they wanted stability on their northern frontier. So Moldavia kept some things intact, like its internal autonomy, its Christian princes and its own administration. At least for a little while, because by the 1700s, a rising Russian empire started pressing in. The Russo-Turkish wars tore through Moldavian territory repeatedly. Then came 1812, aka the year when the Treaty of Bucharest was signed. Russia sliced away the eastern half of Moldavia. That's the land between the Prut and Dniester rivers, then called it Besarabia. And that new border between eastern and western Moldavia, that would go on to define everything. See, while the eastern half became a Russian province where imperial authorities spent the next century trying to convince people they weren't actually Romanian, the western half eventually merged with Wallachia to form the modern country of Romania. So yeah, you can imagine it was a little bit confusing and complicated for the people living there at the time. Then came World War I. As the Russian Empire collapsed into revolution, Besarabia seized the moment. In 1918, they declared independence and voted to unite with Romania. The only thing was, the new Soviet Union never accepted this. So in 1940, after the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact quietly handed Besarabia over to the Soviet sphere of influence, Moscow issued a harsh ultimatum. Romania, completely isolated, handed it over without a fight. Thus, the Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic was born. But wait, it gets messier. Romania allied with Nazi Germany during World War II, took the territory back from 1941 to 1944, and then the Soviets reconquered it. During both of these occupations, you can just imagine how severe the atrocities were. If not, Let me paint you a brief tragic picture. Jews and Roma were systematically deported and massacred under the Romanian German occupation. Then, when the Soviets took back control, they launched mass deportations to Siberia, followed by a brutal famine in the late 1940s. Engineered largely by Soviet grain requisitions, it killed well over 100,000 people. And the Soviets didn't stop there. See, one thing you need to understand is that the Soviet project here wasn't just a political agenda, it was also cultural. They forced the Moldovan language to switch from the Latin alphabet to the Cyrillic alphabet. They aggressively pushed the idea that Moldovans were a completely separate ethnic group from Romanians, and they made Russian the mandatory language for any kind of career advancement. Yeah, so when Gorbachev's reforms finally opened the political door in the late 1980s, everything that had been forcefully suppressed came flooding back out. Protests, language laws, the return of the Latin alphabet. Then on August 27th, 1991, total independence. Or so it seemed. See, the heavily industrialised Russian-speaking region just east of the Dnestr River, Transnistria, absolutely refused to be part of this new pro-Romanian Moldova. Meaning there was an immediate ideological conflict. And how do two opposing ideas usually resolve conflict out here? That's right, war. Eventually, Russian forces stepped in to back the separatists. A ceasefire was called in 1992, and Transnistria has existed in a kind of Twilight Zone frozen limbo ever since. Technically, the world recognises it as part of Moldova, but practically, it runs its own government, prints its own money, and keeps Russian troops permanently stationed on the ground. And yeah, as exciting as their story is, the geography's even more so, especially if you factor in the fact that this country is literally tiny. It's only about 33,700 square kilometres, which is about 13,000 square miles, or just about the size of Maryland. It's also entirely landlocked, sandwiched between Romania to the west and Ukraine, wrapping around the north, east and south. You know what that means? No coastline and no ocean. What it has instead are rivers, hills, and an almost absurd amount of fertile soil. So let's talk about them. The two rivers that defined its history are the Prut and the Dnestr. The Prut runs the entire western border with Romania, and the Dnestr cuts through the east, and everything between them is essentially Moldova. Rolling hills, forests in the centre, flatter plains to the north and south. The highest point in the country, that's going to be Belenisht Hill. It reaches 430 metres, or about 1,400 feet, which if you compare it to the Alps or Mount Everest is pretty small. But what Moldova lacks in height, it makes up for in fertile soil. See, about 75% of the soil is Chernozem. It's the black earth that farmers dream about. It's rich, dark and deep, which is why this land has been inhabited and fought over since before recorded history. So as you can imagine, the land itself? Absolutely gorgeous and generous too. Almost half the country is arable. Vineyards cover the countryside, and most rural households have their own wine cellars, the way Finnish homes have saunas. In fact, did you know that Moldova produces more wine than most countries 3 times its size? Yeah, and it's all because beneath the surface, Moldova hides a literal subterranean empire. First you have the city of Craiova, an underground wine city, with 120 kilometres or 75 miles of literal streets and tunnels carved into the limestone rock. And then, just down the road, you have the Milesh Timic winery, which holds the official Guinness World Record for the largest wine collection on Earth, housing over 1.5 million bottles. The legendary Yuri Gagarin, the Soviet cosmonaut who was literally the first human in space, actually visited Craiova back in 1966. And according to local legend, he got so tipsy on the wine that he got lost in the underground tunnels and didn't resurface for 2 days. Think you're up for the adventure? Add this city to your custom travel plan, linked in the description below, and you'll get to do just that. So now that we know what we're working with, geographically speaking, let's see how all of that pans out economically. Shall we? Even though, on the surface, Moldova should be doing pretty well for itself, considering its rich soil, river connections and wine. It's long been considered one of the poorest economies in Europe. By GDP per capita, Moldova sits right at the bottom of the European table, and when you trace the reasons back, they all point to things we already know. 1, decades of Soviet central planning. that left industries concentrated in Transnistria, which then broke away and took those economic engines with it. 2, there was a transition to market economics in the 1990s that was rocky at best and chaotic at worst. 3, farms that were collectivized under Soviet rule broke up after independence, then were left without the infrastructure or investment to actually function. And 4, there's a massive brain drain that's been bleeding the country of its young, talented people for 30 years. Yes, there's a lot of reasons why Moldova's at the bottom of the ranks right now. But once upon a time, back in 2004, Moldova actually hit an unbelievable peak performance. After years of post-Soviet stagnation, the country suddenly skyrocketed with an incredible 8% GDP growth rate in a single year, driven by a massive boom in wine exports and a surge of money flowing back from Moldovans working abroad. Now, while Moldova's no doubt facing some hurdles, it's showing a promising future. I mean, just look at the numbers. In 2025, its economy recovered and grew by 2.4%. Now, the World Bank projects a 1.9% growth in 2026, before accelerating to a much healthier 3.8% in 2027. Still small numbers, but at least they're pointing in the right direction, which is up. And you want to know how they're making it all work? It's all thanks to the EU accession process. Moldova applied for EU membership in 2022 and received candidate status the same year, officially opening up full negotiations. That move alone unlocked a pipeline of funding, reform incentives, and intense institutional pressure that's been reshaping the country from the inside out. What's more, the Reform and Growth Facility, which is a Brussels programme, is conditioning those funds on actual policy changes, judicial reform, major anti-corruption measures, and the modernisation of state institutions. I'm telling you this because Moldova's president, Maia Sandu, has actually staked her entire political project on this exact path. But there's a catch. The progress depends heavily on something Moldova can't control: the war in Ukraine. Russia's invasion next door has disrupted trade routes, spooked international investors, and practically kept the whole region under a cloud of geopolitical uncertainty. So, on top of everything it's been dealing with, Moldova also has to learn how to navigate intense Russian energy pressure, especially since it's been historically relying on gas piped through, of all places, Transnistria. On the bright side, they've got other projects to fall back on, specifically ecotourism. The Playa Olfagulu Nature Reserve hosts an annual beach festival drawing 3,000 to 4,000 visitors, generating around €25,000 locally in a single event. Plus, there's a brand new bridge coming that connects the region to Romania across the Prut River. That means there's a possibility of actual, thriving tourism infrastructure, guest houses, hiking trails, wineries, and birdwatching tours on the horizon. But you know what? Everything Moldova is today, you can probably trace back through what you've already seen and heard. The soil that fed empires, the borders that kept shifting, the identity that kept getting rewritten by whoever's in charge. And yet, something survived all of it. One of which was carpets. A traditional Moldovan woven wool carpet can take 4 women up to 2 years to finish entirely by hand. It's passed down through generations, using complex geometric patterns that were heavily established by the 18th century and haven't changed much since. The weaving technique is now officially UNESCO listed, jointly with Romania, which tells you everything about where Moldova's cultural roots actually lie. You can dress a country up in Soviet boots and Cyrillic letters, but what's underneath them doesn't really go away, which, now that I think about it, is the crux of Moldovan culture. Yes, it's Romanian at its core. Yes, it's shaped by centuries of contact with Byzantine, Slavic, Ottoman, and eventually Soviet influences, but it was never replaced by any of them. So you could say that Moldova isn't one single monolithic culture. It's more like 4, running completely parallel, sometimes overlapping with each other. There's the deeply local bubble that encompasses wine, food, massive weddings, and traditional folk music called musica populara, the stuff that crosses every political line. Then there's the Romanian language cultural world, which experienced a genuine revival in the late 1980s and has been growing closer to Bucharest ever since. Along the same vein, there's the Russian language bubble, which was inherited from the Soviet era. It's still significant, don't get me wrong. but its cultural footprint has been shrinking noticeably since 2022. And then there's a newer one, a younger, Anglophone, shaped by social media and time spent working or studying abroad. This bubble is increasingly comfortable calling itself European. But what does it mean to be European for Moldovans? Well, it's become something much more than a distant political position out here. For the average person, Europe has become a literal image of what normal, dignified life could look like. It means cycle lanes in Chisinau, a quiet village finally getting working sewage, and a decent school, a judiciary system that isn't for sale. They're simple things, but they make a world of difference. So now, do you understand why Moldova's such an interesting country? If you know any other interesting Moldovan facts, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, you'll love this next one.